If you're working in a sustainability team, influencing the decision makers feels like a really practical thing that you can do to try and have quite a big sort of shift and in educating them, engaging them, exciting them about the kind of opportunity.
This is The Energy Canvas, bringing energy solutions to life, with your host, Celtic Dynamics CEO, Dylan Walsh.
Hey, Dylan here. Today we are talking about climate change, biodiversity loss and inequality are no longer side issues for business. They're shaping who survives and who doesn't. Joining me is Zoe Le Grand, Managing Director for UK and Europe at Forum for the Future, work with global brands to build a just, regenerative future. We're looking at how businesses are really responding, where progress is stalling, and what leadership actually looks like when the pressure is on. Zoe Le Grand, welcome to the Energy Canvas.
Thank you so much, Dylan. I'm delighted to be here.
So I suppose there's a broad scope we could talk about probably for 4 hours.
Yeah.
You know, it's a
big topic.
Yeah. But I suppose, okay, the big picture of it is, how is the world fundamentally changing right now, I suppose?
Yeah, and I think, obviously that's a kind of a massive question. It feels really pertinent, actually, even just today. It feels like the news headlines are crazy. Presumably people will be listening to this podcast at sort of different times, but, even just today, there's been a huge amount of geopolitical activity with Donald Trump in Venezuela and kind of various other things kind of going on. But I think kind of the background hum, if you like, is a lack of progress on sort of those macro issues like climate change. So, we're seeing climate impacts are increasing all over the world. In the last few years, we've had loads of floods in Pakistan, Valencia, Californian wildfires. It just feels like kind of all over the place there are big climate impacts. At the same time, actually, the temperatures are rising. So 2024 was the hottest year on record. I think the jury's still out on 2025. I think maybe all the figures haven't quite come in, but I know that the summer in the UK, for instance, was the hottest and sunniest I think we've ever had. So it feels like kind of, much as there's a lot of sort of day-to-day noise about the different changes in geopolitics, actually some of these sort of big kind of broad environmental sort of landscape issues are also consistently kind of beginning to really kind of impact on a day-to-day level. I think there are other things going on around, biodiversity collapse. Inequality just seems to get kind of worse and worse as well. So yeah, I don't know, Brave New World, that's probably not quite right. It feels like slightly like different world, certainly from the one that, I grew up in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I suppose in light of it, there's a lot going on the geopolitics, yeah? And I suppose even our own conversations with clients were, with the changes geopolitically worldwide, the shift from, was it a priority for business leaders or not, was a big question. So I suppose if you're talking to a business owner now, why does the shift kind of matter to them, rather than just maybe their sustainability or energy guys, or something like that?
Yeah, and that's it. Like it doesn't feel like it's a niche like eco brand kind of issue anymore. Like, so I work with a lot of multinationals, a lot of like really mainstream brands, the likes of sort of Nestle or Walmart, people like that, and they're talking about the risks to their value chains. They're seeing kind of impacts happening in their value chains in West Africa or Southeast Asia, or kind of really around the world, as well as and there's also there's a lot more awareness of these issues as well amongst consumers. So people are also using their buying powers to a certain extent to kind of choose the brands that they feel like are kind of really on top of these sorts of issues, or are really like innovating or producing super green products or that kind of thing. So I think there's it's been interesting to me. I think I've worked in sustainable business for 15 odd years, and it used to be very much like, the conversations we'd have with businesses were like, in the future, this is going to be something you need to be aware of. It's something that you need to think about your grandchildren and how will they think about whether you've responded to these sorts of things through your business. And actually nowadays they're coming to us and saying, we have to act on all of these issues. Our supply chains are getting hit today. And actually, we really need to kind of transform our business to be one which is low carbon, which is better for the environment, which is better for society. So yeah, I think we're really seeing it moving from that sort of what used to be a kind of maybe green eco niche into being actually just sort of mainstream. I mean, almost business as usual, but I think we're not quite there yet, but definitely sort of getting much more mainstream.
And what do you think is something that they get wrong first? Like what would be like a common or first thing they usually get wrong?
I think the thing which businesses tend to get wrong, and I think it's a human thing, is you kind of overestimate how little change might happen. So you kind of, if you're doing the next 3-year plan, you might expect that actually a lot of the things will remain the same. So the sorts of challenges that you might plan for as a business are like new entrants into your marketplace, or kind of, competitors outcompeting you on price, or, that kind of thing. Whereas actually, I think what we're seeing is that the kind of whole context in which you're working is likely to be very, very different. So you can't expect that you'll have a stable supply chain. You can't expect that kind of regulation is just going to stay the same and won't be any kind of more challenging. You can't expect that your clients won't have any more kind of demanding requirements of you. And so I think what businesses get wrong is they'll assume that kind of, to a certain extent, the context will remain stable, and what they're planning for is what their response to that context should be. What should we do? And whereas actually, I think what we're seeing is the context is likely to be wildly different and moving at a really fast pace. And so what you have to do is, what we tend to advise people to do is to plan against different scenarios and say, actually, we could see a scenario where regulation really ramps up, or we could see a scenario where, I don't know what it might be, disclosure requirements and things really kind of ramp up. And so I think if I was, if there was a business that was going to get things wrong, it would be because they're just gone, everything will stay the same. This is what we plan to do. And actually, everything's likely to change, in which case the cost of action, actually, you're going to have to take action whatever happens. So then the kind of business case changes, because then you're like, well, okay, so then it's just what kind of action are we going to take, not are we going to take action or not.
Yeah, it's more like risk management for future kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so, absolutely. Yeah.
Forecast in terms of what's actually going on is usually the approach for the majority of clients anyway I talk to. Yeah. And then the risk management side is always like a second thought. It's all, even in every regard, even accounting and stuff like, yeah, even though it's well established in accounting, what's like something maybe that you're thinking they should have, like, okay, where this could happen, we should just have a policy or a procedure in place. If this happens, this is going to be, let's stick it in our book somewhere. What's like one that you think would be useful for the majority of clients?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of different kinds of risk. So, if you really just think about climate change, you've got physical risk, right? So if you've got like manufacturing facilities, if you've got offices, if you've got warehouses, then they might be at risk of flooding, they might be at risk of overheating, that it might be difficult for your staff to get to work if transport's disrupted because of sort of like intense weather events, that kind of thing. So I think there's definitely something about, physical risk, and it feels, we've had a really cold week in London, things start to grind to a halt quite quickly. So it's something which feels it's kind of obvious. It's like probably an obvious risk management thing to do. But I think there's also a sort of transition risk. So as the world wakes up more and more to the need to reduce carbon emissions, the likelihood is regulations are going to get more sort of stringent. So if you're not on the front foot with that, you're going to get sort of caught out. And so then that the risk of compliance, I guess, sort of the risk of sort of future compliance kind of needs to be on people's radar. I think another one which we often talk about at Forums of Future, I think it sounds a bit, it sounds a little bit kind of out there, maybe a little bit sci-fi for people, but it's actually civilizational risk. There are definitely scientists who are saying that the impacts of climate change are faster and more intense than we ever expected. And actually, if they continue and we hit things like tipping points, which are going to accelerate things even further, it threatens the kind of resources that we actually all rely on, which in turn threatens the kind of peace and stability of the world. And so it's easy in a conversation like this to really just focus on the business risk, or what's your business going to be facing in the next sort of 3 years. But I do think there's a slightly wider case to make, which is to say, actually, if we want to have a livable climate, in the next 20, 30 years, that's a true business risk as well, as the immediate, are you going to flood next year kind of risk.
Yeah, and I suppose you've got the risk then to your supply chain from affecting other people, and you've got your risk of, your leisure in your own life, if that gets impacted, or even war-torn situations or whatever, Yeah. So
yeah, exactly.
I suppose there's knock-on effects in a lot of ways.
And we're seeing like agriculture is a kind of, I guess, an easier one to talk about. Like we've seen it over the last few years around like tomatoes or around olive oil or things which we take for granted as being quite accessible, quite cheap products. Actually, have been affected by a long hot summer, and prices have gone right up. And it sort of suddenly feels quite sort of visceral because it's the food that we actually eat.
How would you think businesses should react then to, or what's the common way businesses are responding to this climate change, biodiversity, or the inequality?
Yeah, so I think if you said like, what's the first thing we should do? Like if you're starting from square one, I think I would always advise companies to look at the issues which are most material to them. So it's those issues which either are going to impact you. So, you look at where your risk areas are, like where are your supply chains in the world? What kind of risks are they facing? Where are your facilities? What kind of risks are they facing? But it's also like, where can you impact on some of these issues kind of the most as well? So it's that double kind of materiality, the way that they talk about it in some of the kind of reporting requirements and disclosure requirements. And I think, it seems like a really sensible place to start. Start with the things which are going to make a big difference to your business, in the short term. I think that feels kind of like a really sensible kind of square one place to start. I'm not sure that there's that many companies which have literally done nothing in any of these areas. I think most companies are sort of, they're kind of begun to wake up to it. They might have some things in place. And I think as well, the other thing though, I feel like conversation so far has been a bit of a downer, mostly led by me telling everyone how awful everything is. But I think the exciting thing about this is actually there's a shed load of like value to gain from acting like well, authentically, ambitiously in this space. And there's loads of examples of where that's happened. So, people, I guess, companies that are sort of purpose driven, that tend to, really take their environmental and social impacts really seriously, like Patagonia, they've, their recruitment and retention has been kind of off the charts. Their employee turnover rates really, really low. Their employee satisfaction rates really, really high. So if you get it right, there's loads of upside. It's really not just about risk management. And that's before we even talk about, efficiencies around energy or new markets you might enter, or, customer share that you might gain, or the fact you're getting ahead of regulation, or, having a more resilient supply chain. So I think, it's definitely not all about like, how do you protect yourself? I think it's also about how do you grow your reach, your impact, your, margins through this agenda, through getting more resilient, through being better for the world.
the way it's worked with a few of our clients as well is it's direct. It's directly going to your profit line. Any benefit you gain from it, like it's almost like, oh, it's easier to hire people. Oh, we get more people working for us. Oh, it's easier to buy stuff that we know is going to be reliable. or it's you've made a saving on energy or some environmental thing, water, whatever, and it goes straight to your profit line. So I do see business owners at the start maybe panicking, and then at the end they're like, oh, we'll do way more of this. You know?
Yeah. I
that's
think so too. And it's funny. It's like, you know, there's been this sort of backlash over this last year, and especially, you know, from the United States, and we're getting a lot more people asking us around the business case, you know, why should I do this and things. And I don't know, like, maybe it's just because I've worked in this area for a long time, but it does seem kind of, it's kind of obvious to me, like there's a very clear business case. There's not, the conversations I have these days are never about the sort of moral argument, although there is one, but it just seems like, what's the business case for inaction here to me?
Yeah, and I suppose some of them it's a comparison thing. It's like, what's the benefit of doing it one way versus another, and things like that. You know, yeah. So yeah. Okay, so I suppose, are you seeing? Well, you mentioned Patagonia there. Are you seeing any other organizations generally step up and gain like some momentum and stuff? Do you know?
Yeah, I think so. So I think, as I said before, I think what I've kind of enjoyed, I suppose, is that there's always been some companies who have been really committed to this sort of stuff and, you know, established along those lines, you know, The Body Shop or, you know, those kind of really famous like eco brands. But actually, I do feel like the mainstream kind of multinationals have really sort of begun to step up in this way. So I think agriculture is quite like, or companies with big agricultural supply chains have got some exciting stuff going on. So people like Nestle,
they've been a big player for a while anyway, kind of. Yeah,
they're a big player. You know, I don't know. They're not necessarily the poster child, right? Like, you know, there's no big multinational which is like amazing across the board and has absolutely no problems with it at all. But at the same time, they've gone out there and they said, actually, we want to create regenerative food systems at scale. And actually, for me, that's so exciting because I'm the biggest food company in the world. So if anyone can do it, they can really make a difference here. But also it's like, they're not just saying like, we want to create an amazing food business at scale. They're talking about food systems, which is like the whole thing, consumption, production, everyone working in it, you know, it's the whole lot. And, you know, they're talking about a regenerative approach. So they're not just saying a low carbon approach or a sort of farmer friendly approach or something like that. They're actually using those words around regeneration, which is like soil health, carbon emissions, farmer livelihoods, community livelihoods, you know, nutrition. Like it brings in all of those things. And there's stuff that like sustainability geeks like me used to talk about, and we'd kind of try not to use that language because it's like, oh, that's a bit, people don't really understand that. And actually, so to have like mainstream, you know, Nestle, or in the US, Walmart's got a huge target around regenerative agriculture, you know, millions of hectares of regenerative agriculture they're kind of committing to. And that's real like game-changing stuff. That's real like system-shifting kind of activities. So I think there are a lot of organisations stepping up. I think what's challenging right now is at the same time you're getting a lot of criticism of some of these big organisations who, largely from the US, I'd say, around the language they're using or around kind of maybe putting goals out there which they don't know how to meet, which is something that, you know, we've advocated for. I still believe that is actually a good way to do it. But at the same time, you know, they're getting a bit of backlash. So what we're seeing is what's called sort of green hushing. You know, and actually I that does worry me a bit. I kind of feel like it's a huge lever for change if those people who are really leading and really ambitious in this area talk about what they're doing, talk about what they're learning, what are they failing at, you know, and that kind of thing. And actually, if you get people going quiet, not only is there a bit less scrutiny, but also there's a bit less kind of followership or like camaraderie around it. And then maybe fewer people will be up for sort of taking on those kind of big, ambitious kind of goals. So I think at the moment we're seeing, like, on the one hand, yeah, like companies stepping up, it's sort of mainstreaming. But on the other hand, actually also, they're kind of going a bit quiet. And I think that's a shame.
Yeah, and I suppose with, you know, the news and stuff over the last while, there's been a big thing against, you know, I was ESG reporting in Europe and it's been slowed down. And then, you know, just transition starting to pick through against a bit more. So where do you think in the next while, what's going to be the focus in terms of, you know, those things don't exist for the sake of just compliance. They exist to try and create a system to get people to move forward to make the system better, you know? So where do you think the spotlight's going to come in the next while? Or...
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't pretend to be a regulation expert or even a kind of EU, you know, policy expert. I definitely think that I think, you know, water's going to be a huge issue. You know, whether it's about sort of water scarcity or like water scarcity in some places, too much water in other places. You know, that feels like that's going to be kind of a huge issue. And that's obviously very geographical and context specific. You know, I feel like it's a weird one because carbon is almost easier. If you save carbon, you know, in the UK but you can't reduce it in somewhere else, it's almost sort of fungible between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas water, it's like you can't pollute one watershed and then clean up a different one and then sort of say, oh, that's fine. So I think water is probably going to come under the spotlight kind of even more. I think nature as well and biodiversity, I think it is actually quite front of mind these days. I've definitely seen, there's now kind of biodiversity COPs and things like that which are happening. But I feel like it's maybe the connection between nature and business isn't quite as clear, or it's not quite as locked into legislation, even though I think that is changing. So I think there are those kind of issues I think are kind of on the way more, or probably get more emphasis.
Even if we take water from, you know, areas that are not severely affected, like say Ireland or whatever, where we get rain all the time, like water stewardship is still something that's a big issue in Ireland and the UK. They I don't know if in the UK they fund it, but in Ireland they fund grants to do a study on it, on your business, you know, and stuff like that. But I think what I think a lot of people don't realize sometimes, which is how I've seen people get caught out, is sometimes you know there's an issue and you're like, I'm going to deal with the energy issue because that's easy, and I know the water issue exists, I'm going to get to that eventually, and I know something else exists, and then it has a knock-on effect somewhere else that they never thought of, and then now that is the real big issue you got to deal with. You know, so I think all the issues kind of exist together, but like you can make a plan for all of them as well, in a way. You can make a little plan. Okay, if this happens, we're going to put someone in charge of this, or we're going to help do this, you know? Yeah. So.
And I think as well, like the key is to not always see them as separate issues. Like I've talked about them like they're separate issues. And when I talk about materiality assessments, you'll say, oh, what's more important, carbon or water? But of course they're related, right? Like, you know, the more climate impacts we get, the more water scarcity there'll be, or too much water, like either way. You know, the more kind of those then water impacts will then have impacts on the kind of the nature in that area as well. And also sort of climate impacts tend to happen most intensively in areas which are least able to cope with it often. So, you know, might be sort of, I don't know, West Africa or, you know, or India, which is getting incredibly hot at the moment. So I think like, it's probably like, and I guess I sort of take some level of responsibility from the sustainability community, because we've kind of said to everyone, right, you need to look at your top 10 issues, but actually they're all totally interrelated and interconnected. And actually, so, in some ways, if your business is trying to take some action, you're probably best off saying, all right, how can we save water in a way that saves energy, in a way that gives us a better relationship with our communities, in a way that makes us a better place to work, and actually sort of try and tackle them all together. Because I think there's a problem at the moment with carbon tunnel vision. Oh my God, we've got all this legislation, we have to reduce carbon straight away. Don't worry about, I don't really understand the biodiversity thing, I won't do anything about that. Oh, it doesn't matter if we kind of squash some livelihoods in the way, who cares about farmers anyway, we just need to really get carbon reduced. And it's a sort of, it's just not reality. These things are all interconnected, because so to address them kind of all together, I think if it's possible.
I think it adds to, let's say you had a project you were trying to do and you were trying to reduce water. Let's say you're a process plant and you're using it for hot water, okay? Or something like that. It has tangible effects all the way along the stream. And looking at it just from carbon, you're probably only looking at your energy savings and money, but there's probably other money savings happening if you look at it together.
Yeah.
So for a business, it's probably easier to make the judgment to do something if they could think of it together, is the way I'd look at it. Do you know?
I think you're right, and I think as well, the point you made is sort of, it's really interesting, what end of the telescope you look at, where you're coming into it from. So there's quite an old example actually, but I absolutely love it. So you might have to indulge me in this example. Go for it. But so there's this brilliant company called Interface who make carpet tiles. Not very exciting. You wouldn't think also particularly eco. But I had a really incredible leader who I think it was probably in the mid-90s, really early kind of pioneer in the sustainability space. And he said, oh my God, my whole business is about petrochemicals. So, and that's what's going to destroy the world. So essentially, I need to revamp my whole business, make it entirely, circular, make it all about recycled materials and things like that. So they've had an incredibly sort of forward-thinking approach to this whole thing. But one of the things that they did is they set up a project called Networks. And what they realized was I think there's a big environmental issue around ghost nets. So ghost nets are discarded fishing nets in the ocean, and I think they're the largest proportion of plastic waste in the ocean. So it's a huge environmental problem. And then you also had fishing communities in places like the Philippines, which were essentially kind of dying. I think the kind of fishing industry was really heavily impacted in that area. So you had a social problem, you had an environmental problem. But I think what was really interesting about what Interface did is actually they realized they also had a supply problem. So they were looking for more recycled plastic. So it's it's a business issue, it's a supply problem, but they also brought it together with then an environmental problem and a social problem. And so they trained up some of the fishing communities to go and kind of harvest the ghost nets to kind of bring them in, so that then Interface then had a kind of a better supply of recycled plastic that they could use in their carpets. I think what's nice about it is, social issue, environmental issue, business issue. But I think they invested about $1 million in it, and they made about 200 million from the product that they produced as a result. So it's that perfect example almost of saying, actually, we want to tackle environmental and social issues as a business, but we've got real business needs here, and we've got real revenue needs. And so it was a great project which kind of delivered on all fronts, if you like.
Yeah, it's kind of like they went to the root cause on both issues and found where it made up, So
yeah,
I think so. Yeah, it's a good one. It's nice as well because it's circular in terms of recycling.
Exactly. Yeah, reduces waste, reduces plastic waste, across the board.
Yeah. On your website, you go on about just and regenerative economy. I suppose if you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a bit jargony, isn't it? So obviously, in my kind of world, we've talked about sustainability for a long time. And really at Forum, I think what we realized is there's something conceptually in sustainability, which is we just need to stop harming the world, and then we can continue. So we need to stop carbon emissions. And actually, on a lot of fronts, we've kind of gone beyond that. So we need to actively restore or regenerate soil, habitats, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, all of those things. So we felt like actually kind of sustainability almost isn't enough nowadays. So we have this phrase where we talk about a just and regenerative economy. So that's an economy which delivers social justice, fairness, equity, equality, and also a regenerated environment. So what that kind of means in terms of what are the principles behind it. So it's about recognizing planetary boundaries. So it's recognizing that actually a lot of the things that we rely on and we assume are free are finite in our world. So, that's like water, clean air, carbon, all of those sorts of things. They've got kind of physical almost boundaries around them. And so just recognizing that we can't just keep, infinitely using materials on what is actually a kind of finite planet. So that's kind of quite core. And it's kind of interesting how fundamental that is and how not everybody always kind of seems to recognize that. So that's kind of one. So what about recognizing planetary boundaries? Second one is about creating and distributing value in new ways. So I think certainly in work with business, the way in which our value chains are set up often leads to quite a lot of sort of exploitation and sort of big profits in some cases, and kind of exploitation almost at the other end of the value chain. So I think there's definitely in a just and regenerative economy, you'd actually be having that value more evenly distributed, and different kinds of business models, distributing value to communities, to individuals, to brands, to corporates, in kind of different and innovative ways. The third kind of principle around it is understanding that humans are a fundamental part of nature. And again, it's one of those things that sort of seems a bit obvious, but I think we often kind of just really separate ourselves. It's like, we have to eat food that's grown in the ground. So if all of our soil is depleted, we're not going to have enough food to eat. We have to breathe clean air. We have to drink clean water. We're human animals. So I think just sort of really, really responding to that and saying, actually, it's not. We don't need to just exploit nature. Like, we're actually fully reliant on it for us sort of day-to-day survival. The fourth one is around respecting everybody's universal rights and kind of potential to thrive. So kind of, I guess that's again coming down to this sort of social justice side of things, and the kind of the fact that like your third tier suppliers have got just as much right to have a thriving kind of life as your people in your head office, and kind of trying to recognize, I guess, that kind of equality across the world and across value chains. And I think the final thing is to recognize that all of this is really kind of underpinned by system change. So one organization isn't going to be able to deliver each of these things. And actually, if we really want to make a proper shift to a just and regenerative economy, there's change across the system that's needed. It's going to be, it's going to be around innovation. It's going to be around policy change. It's going to be around how we live our lives. It's going to be around the sorts of cultures, the sorts of norms we have, the sorts of mindsets we bring. So it's sort of all of those things are going to be required to meet this, to generate this kind of just and regenerative economy that we think is needed.
Yeah. Something that comes to mind then is like, you may have people that they want to do something, yeah, but they've been stuck in the incremental change, as in, okay, we're going to make a list of stuff, do one by one, little bit by little. How would you recommend they maybe take a first step, or where would you tell them to focus first if they want to make like more bigger changes or want to make more momentum with it as part of their ethos or something? Do you know? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think system change feels really overwhelming, right? And like actually, a lot of the stuff I've just said is it feels like outside the kind of outside your sphere of control. It's hard to make this stuff happen. But I think probably so. If somebody wanted to go from like incremental change to more sort of transformative stuff, I think I'd really advise them to look just beyond their sphere of control. So look into their kind of sphere of influence as well. And that might be about working with your suppliers really differently, or kind of innovating together with your suppliers. It might be about working with your clients really differently, or your customers. But also it would be about kind of working with your trade associations and the universities that you work with maybe on R&D and kind of some of those other actors who help to then shape the policy context in which you're working, which then helps to shift like the whole system. So I think like it could feel, I suppose, less satisfying because, you know, within your own like factory, you might be able to make a change, which means that you reduce your energy like costs by sort of 20%. And that feels like, wow, job done, amazing. And whereas having a kind of a conversation with your trade association about could you lobby government for stricter carbon targets, like doesn't kind of feel like so immediate. You don't feel like your impact's so kind of obvious. But I do think like both are necessary. It's like you need those kind of big, wider, long-term plays as well as your like short-term incremental stuff you can just shift. So I think, that's what I'd advise. Like try and do both.
Have you had any clients that have made a practical change that's made a big difference or actually moved them forward?
Yeah. So I think I'm trying to think kind of what the best example kind of might be for that. I think it's often been around where like leaders have had kind of a big mindset shift. So I think that's sort of traditionally where the big changes tend to kind of come from. And, you know, I talked about interface and that was kind of all about the leader. I know that kind of Paul Pullman, CEO of Unilever for a long time, made a massive difference about their kind of approach to sustainability. So I think, you know, if you're working in a sustainability team, influencing the decision makers feels like a really practical thing that you can do to try and have quite a big sort of shift and you know, in educating them, engaging them, exciting them about the kind of opportunity. I mean, ESG requirements have, I think, probably made quite a big difference. I think, you know, getting your act together on what the legislation that you're impacted by or the disclosure requirements or what your investors are asking for, you know, that ultimately will make a sort of a big shift. And then I think kind of innovating products and services is another area where I've seen, you know, companies kind of make quite a big difference. I think probably the reason why I sound a little bit tentative is I think that there is a marketplace for kind of more eco products. I'm not sure that the evidence suggests that people will pay a premium always, you know, and so I'm not going to promise that, right?
Yeah, it's probably now got to the point where there's eco solutions that need to be at the lower point of the market so that they're accessible. And, you know, like I think we have a lot of good technology at the high end of the market. It's the middle and the lower end that they need a little bit more support or they need something that's more accessible a lot of the time, you know.
And hopefully, you know, if you get then sort of those higher end things, they might build the supply chains, build the supplies to help to reduce the costs of some of those inputs to help to kind of, you know, make it more mass market. So maybe that's just part of like a change curve almost.
Yeah, I do think the volume exists though at the lower end. You know, like they get the volume advantage if they can figure it out, you know. So like I do think there's stuff there that anyone can get in on if they figure it out. Yeah, it's how can leaders be more ambitious without feeling like they're putting their business at risk.
Yeah, I think it, like I almost challenge the premise of the question. Like, you know, I think for me, there's risk either way. There's risk of inaction and there's risk of action. So it's sort of like, it's more like kind of how do you trade off the risks that you're looking at rather than how can you be brave enough to take a risk in this direction?
I suppose the question probably stems from a pre-ESG kind of thinking, you know, how do we convince an investor that it's worth doing this when it's scary to do that when they're rocking about other stuff, you know? So that's probably where that comes from more. Yeah.
And especially in the short term, right? Like I think there probably are trade-offs that you'd have to make in the short term. And so you've got to make a kind of business case around that. I think, you know, there are some things which, you'd have to invest in up front, which might not pay off for a long time. So I can see that that feels more like, well, yeah, there's other things which we would invest in less and would pay off in a shorter time. But I think at the same time, I think also the appetite for ambition probably is very unique to a company. You know, if you're like, I don't know, one of the big tech companies that as their whole kind of raison d'etre is innovation. You know, they're always way on the front foot. They're like, you know, they're always ambitious. They're always like shoot for the moon type companies. And then you go, well, cool. Well, obviously we'd shoot for the moon around sustainability issues then, because that's what we do. Whereas if you're a company which actually tends to be quite incremental, or, you know, doesn't tend to be kind of very, very innovative, then the case for being extra ambitious on this is going to be a bit harder, or a bit more based on risk mitigation. So I think, you know, you'd have to know the kind of culture and the position of your company in order to make a good case for ambition and kind of go along with like the grain, I guess, or the kind of what's culturally like acceptable at the company.
Yeah. And I think you need to be realistic a little bit, because at the bigger end of the market, they can be, you know, more willing to do stuff a lot of the time, or they've already tried a lot of stuff and they're almost budget constraint risks for them is in what do we do and how do we make it fit towards budget or towards ROI, you know? Yeah. But then for smaller companies, they might be super ambitious, but they have the opposite budget problem. They don't have the capital, but if they need to figure out how they get support or whatever, and they've got
less to undo. Like it is, it's a good point. It's like often like turning it's not the right analogy, turning the oil tanker around. Mm-hmm. You know, that's often like really hard, even if you've got lots of sort of capital or lots of ambition or lots of kind of, you know, goodwill. Mm-hmm. And whereas sometimes if you're small, you can be more nimble and you can you're less invested in existing, I don't know, energy supplies or you know, locations or whatever. So sometimes it's easier.
And I think sometimes they can shift the boat earlier. So before it becomes an oil tanker, it's just a little boat will shift it.
They just row in a slightly different direction.
Yeah. Well, what changes are you seeing now that give you confidence for the future?
So I think, you know, as you'd imagine, I'm keeping quite a close eye on sort of our companies rowing back, especially when you hear, you know, missives from Donald Trump or whatever around DE&I and things. I think the evidence suggests that actually companies kind of aren't as much as you'd expect. So I think those companies that are already committed are doing it anyway. I think, you know, so there's a study done in Harvard Business Review which said that sort of 85% of kind of the 25 top companies by market capitalization are holding course on their climate commitments. And I've seen other sort of similar stats. So whether it's about CEO kind of commitment or confidence around sustainability, or whether it's about like actual just disclosure and commitments and things like that. So it seems like, you know, it's always in the kind of 80s or 90s% feel like actually they're staying the course in terms of their sustainability commitments. I think, you know, there are some big organizations that are, I think there are some which are consolidating commitments or focusing commitments because they set them 10 years ago and they set them as like moonshot goals. And so as you get closer to it, you go, well, we've learned a lot and actually we don't really think this is achievable in the way in which we originally conceived it. So, you know, I think it's understandable if you've got like a PepsiCo or a Unilever who are kind of actually saying, you know, we had this whole range of commitments. We're actually going to consolidate, focus on things we do really, really well. And actually, these are our new sets of commitments. So, and there's some kind of activity in that area, but it doesn't kind of worry me too much. I think things like the legislation coming in actually is brilliant. Like it's expensive, it's stressful, there's been quite a lot of uncertainty, it's driving a lot of activity towards reporting and away from innovation, which I think is a bad thing. But ultimately it's bringing up the baseline and it's putting a lot of data out there so that actually you can really understand where carbon emissions are and, you know, what people are doing to kind of reduce them. So I think that shift is actually like really exciting. And you know, can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I think in the legislation as well, one benefit that I'd give ESG over the others is the fact they've added in social stuff a bit more, and stuff that wasn't just technology oriented focus was a big benefit to it, because we've done a good few for clients now, and it's all that stuff that the real ad was for them. You know, it's all the like, how do we impact our employees? How do we impact the community? How do we make sure our supply chain know what they're doing? All that. And that was like a huge shift for them in terms of getting them more confidence that they are acting a good way, being responsible, trying to be sustainable. But it's less cumbersome, that stuff, once you look at it once. You know? Yeah. So, and then the other stuff they can figure out as they go, like, and that's the financial bit maybe. But yeah, I do think although it's been delayed again in Europe, you know, I do think it had a good impact, and it will have a good impact in the end for moving people towards the right way, I think.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there may be sort of transition pain, you know, as people kind of, have to get all the right things in place. But yeah, I think it's a good thing.
We're kind of getting near the end now. So just to wrap up, what we do on every podcast is someone leaves a question from the past podcast, and we ask you if you would like to leave a question for industry. It could be anything, and we'll ask the next guest for you, you know. So do you have a question prepared maybe first, or do you?
Yeah. So I think the question for me is probably about essentially how can businesses and organizations in your sector really kind of work better and more closely with communities. One of the projects we're doing in India is about the renewable energy kind of transition or rollouts, and actually how it can be done in a way which boosts livelihoods, because there's a risk that kind of, you know, some of the new renewable energy infrastructure actually is kind of, I don't know, let's say on sort of farmers' lands, or it's, you know, it's not really taking into account the kind of impacts on the local community. So I feel like that's what I'm interested in. There's loads of interesting stuff going on in this space, but, you know, I'd love to kind of know from your like listeners, you know, actually how really could you kind of deliver local community kind of benefit that maybe goes beyond just jobs, which are really important. Yeah, kind of thinking about innovation in that space.
Yeah, I suppose it's like not just looking at the externalities caused, but how would someone shape it in a way that it would benefit the community? Do you know?
Yeah.
So,
like active, positive, you know, kind of benefits to the community.
That's a good question. Okay, and the question that was left from the last guest was, what are the main barriers stopping organizations from engaging with nature at every level?
I did think about this a bit. I think you know, it's probably a lack of understanding. You know, it's probably people seeing it as being a technical area of expertise, which it is, but, you know, people then sort of putting that in maybe the too hard box. Maybe there's a lack of practical tools. Like, how do you break down the idea of nature into actually what are your immediate impacts? What are the things that you can do, you know, kind of first? What do you do second? What do you do third? But I think it's also about people seeing it as a nice to have. Like, I still think in some ways the way that the question's phrased around nature maybe puts it in people's minds as being something that's beautiful and nice and something you might engage with in your spare time, and not really saying, actually, you know what, like, yeah, if you're a food business, I mean, obviously you're fully reliant on nature, but even, you know, in our urban environments, we're really reliant on nature, and, you know, kind of really seeing it actually as being, this is a core business opportunity and a risk, when I think people, just see it, that like the barrier is that people just go, oh, that's something which we'll do as part of our CSR activities, not like our core strategy.
Yeah, and I suppose if nature's all around you, wherever you are, so you have to think about it that way too, like, you know.
And we're part of nature, you know. Yeah.
Zoe, thanks so much for joining us. Really thoughtful insights on where business is heading and what leadership actually demands today. Thanks for listening to the Energy Canvas.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you get the next episode automatically. Also, please do share with a friend who you think would find it interesting. Just tell them to search for The Energy Canvas with Celtic Dynamics on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by CelticDynamics.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.